The palace of Topkapi breathed differently that night. Oil lamps flickered against marble walls as whispers slipped through silk curtains, carrying fear, disbelief, and awe. For the first time in generations, an Ottoman sultan was not ending his day with a concubine, but with a lawful wife. Hurrem Sultan, once a captured girl torn from her homeland, now crossed the threshold of a chamber that history had never prepared for her. Outside, the empire slept unaware that one of its oldest traditions had just died in silence. This was no ordinary wedding night. There were no drums echoing through the corridors, no celebrations meant for the masses. The gravity of the moment demanded secrecy. Inside those walls, Sultan Suleiman, the most powerful ruler of his age, made a choice that would echo far beyond passion or romance. By binding himself to Hurrem in marriage, he shattered an unwritten law that had governed the Ottoman dynasty for centuries: sultans did not marry. Love was indulgence. Marriage was danger. As Hurrem stood before him, adorned not merely as a bride but as a declaration, the balance of the empire shifted. In that chamber, power changed its language. No longer would influence flow only through bloodlines and military conquest. It would now pass through whispered counsel, shared glances, and a woman whose voice the sultan chose to hear above all others. The harem, once a shadowed world of competition and silence, had just found its queen. By dawn, nothing appeared different beyond the palace walls. The markets opened, prayers were called, and the empire marched on. Yet the future of the Ottoman dynasty had been quietly rewritten overnight. A single wedding night had transformed Hurrem from favored woman to political force, and the empire from an unbroken tradition into a new and uncertain era. Hurrem's rise from enslaved concubine to the most trusted companion of Sultan Suleiman was a transformation so unlikely that it unsettled the very foundations of Ottoman tradition. She entered the imperial harem not as a noblewoman or diplomatic bride, but as a captive, one of many young women taken from distant lands and stripped of their former identities. In the rigid hierarchy of the Ottoman court, such women were meant to remain replaceable, their purpose limited to pleasing the ruler and bearing sons before fading into obscurity. Power was never meant to follow them. Yet Hurrem refused to disappear into silence. What set her apart was not merely beauty or fortune, but an intelligence sharpened by survival. From her earliest days in the harem, she understood that influence in this world did not come through defiance, but through mastery of its rules. She learned languages, customs, and court etiquette with remarkable speed. More importantly, she learned how to read people, how to anticipate fear, ambition, and desire. Where others relied on charm alone, Hurrem wielded wit, humor, and emotional insight, turning conversations into quiet victories. Sultan Suleiman, himself a poet and philosopher, was drawn to this rare combination. Hurrem did not behave like a submissive concubine. She spoke openly, laughed freely, and engaged him intellectually, offering companionship rather than obedience. This alone was a violation of expectation. Ottoman sultans were accustomed to women who listened, not women who answered. Over time, Suleiman began to trust her not just with his affection, but with his thoughts, his frustrations, and his doubts as a ruler. Trust, once given, became dependency. As her position strengthened, Hurrem did something no concubine before her had dared: she displaced the old order. By becoming Suleiman's constant presence, she effectively ended the practice of rotating favored women in the harem. This move was subtle but revolutionary. It broke the system designed to prevent emotional attachment and ensure dynastic neutrality. Her exclusivity was not granted by decree, it was earned through an emotional bond the court could neither control nor sever. The shock of her ascent was felt far beyond the harem walls. Ministers, princes, and palace officials recognized the danger of a woman who could speak to the sultan without intermediaries. Hurrem's voice began to echo in decisions, alliances, and perceptions. She was no longer an ornament of the court, but a presence within its heart. From a position meant to be powerless, she reshaped her fate, and in doing so, proved that the greatest threat to tradition was not rebellion, but intimacy. The decision of Sultan Suleiman to legally marry Hurrem sent shockwaves through the Ottoman court because it violated a practice so deeply ingrained that it functioned as an unspoken law. For centuries, Ottoman sultans had avoided marriage to preserve political stability. Instead, they took concubines, ensuring that no single woman or family could claim permanent influence over the throne. This system was carefully designed to prevent rival power centers, protect the sultan's absolute authority, and avoid the dynastic conflicts that had plagued other empires. By choosing marriage, Suleiman challenged not only custom, but the very architecture of Ottoman rule. Within the palace, disbelief quickly turned to alarm. Courtiers understood that this act transformed Hurrem from a favored woman into a legally recognized partner of the sultan, granting her unprecedented legitimacy. A wife could not be dismissed, replaced, or quietly sidelined. Her position was protected by religious law and imperial recognition. This meant that Hurrem's presence was no longer dependent on Suleiman's affection alone, it was now anchored in permanence. For an empire built on control and hierarchy, permanence was dangerous. The reaction extended beyond the palace walls. Scholars and religious authorities questioned the implications of such a union. While Islam permitted marriage, the Ottoman dynasty had deliberately avoided it at the highest level to maintain neutrality among heirs and mothers. Suleiman's marriage blurred the line between personal devotion and statecraft, unsettling a system that thrived on emotional distance. The Sultan was no longer an untouchable figure above human bonds, he had openly embraced one. Politically, the marriage disrupted succession politics. Hurrem's children gained a legitimacy that others lacked, and this altered calculations among princes and their supporters. Alliances shifted quietly, and fears of future conflict grew. Officials worried that favor would no longer be distributed evenly, that access to the Sultan would now pass through a single woman. Influence, once diffused across institutions, appeared to be concentrating behind closed doors. For the Islamic world beyond Istanbul, the news carried symbolic weight. Suleiman was not merely a ruler, he was the caliph, the guardian of Islamic authority. His personal choices were inseparable from his public image. By marrying Hurrem, a former slave of foreign origin, he redefined the boundaries of status, lineage, and power. To some, it was an act of devotion, to others, a dangerous precedent that threatened the delicate balance between faith, tradition, and empire. On the wedding night itself, the meaning of Hurrem's existence within the Ottoman world was irrevocably transformed. Until that moment, no matter how favored she was, she remained bound by the fragile status of a concubine, a position defined by impermanence. Concubines could rise, fall, or vanish without warning, their influence dependent entirely on the Sultan's will. That night dissolved that uncertainty. Through marriage, Hurrem crossed a boundary that no woman of her origin had ever crossed, stepping into a role that redefined power inside the empire's most guarded institution. This transformation was not symbolic alone, it was legal, religious, and political. As Suleiman's lawful wife, Hurrem was now protected by Islamic law and imperial recognition. She could no longer be dismissed or replaced under the old rules of the harem. Her presence beside the Sultan became institutional rather than conditional. The intimacy of that night sealed more than a union of bodies, it sealed a shift in authority. Hurrem's words, thoughts, and concerns now carried a weight that no concubines ever could. Inside the palace, this realization spread quietly and uneasily. Officials, eunuchs, and women of the harem understood that access to the Sultan had changed forever. The channels of influence that once flowed through tradition and protocol were narrowing. Hurrem now stood at the threshold between Suleiman and his empire, able to speak to him not as a servant seeking favor, but as a partner whose counsel could not be dismissed as indulgence. The distinction mattered deeply in a court where perception shaped survival. For Hurrem herself, the night represented security earned through endurance. Her future, once balanced on the unpredictable tides of favor, now had structure. Her children's fate was no longer uncertain, their claim strengthened by her new status. In an empire where succession was often decided by bloodshed, legitimacy was power, and that legitimacy was born in the silence of that chamber. Every whisper of fabric, every guarded moment between husband and wife carried consequences that extended far beyond dawn. What made the transformation so profound was its quietness. No edict announced the shift, no public ceremony explained its meaning. Yet from that night onward, the empire's inner rhythm changed. Hurrem was no longer a figure within the system, she was a force reshaping it from within, her authority rooted not in command, but in proximity, trust and permanence that could never again be undone. As news of the marriage settled into the consciousness of the palace, a deeper realization began to take hold among the elite: the old system governing the harem had been permanently broken. For centuries, the Ottoman concubine structure functioned as a controlled mechanism designed to prevent any woman from gaining lasting influence. Favor was meant to be temporary, rotated deliberately so that affection never hardened into power. With Hurrem's marriage, that carefully engineered balance collapsed. The elite understood that this was not an exception, it was an end. The significance lay not only in Hurrem's elevation, but in what her elevation made impossible. If a concubine could become a lawful wife, then the unspoken rules that kept women politically disposable no longer held absolute authority. The precedent was dangerous. Palace officials, harem administrators, and rival women recognized that the system designed to limit attachment had failed at its core. Emotional exclusivity, once forbidden, had proven stronger than tradition. Within the harem, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Rival women who once competed for fleeting moments of attention now faced a sealed door. Their ambitions, once fueled by hope and calculation, dissolved into quiet despair. The future they had trained for, bearing sons, earning favor, influencing succession, was no longer attainable in the same way. Hurrem's permanence erased possibility itself. The harem was no longer a ladder, it had become a wall. For the palace elite, the collapse of the old system carried broader political implications. The concubine model had protected the empire from dynastic factions tied to powerful families. By elevating a single woman above all others, Suleiman reintroduced the risk of concentrated influence, precisely what earlier sultans had feared. Ministers and advisors could no longer rely on predictable neutrality within the inner court. Power was beginning to cluster, and clustering bred vulnerability. This shift also altered how loyalty was measured. Where allegiance had once been directed toward institutions and protocol, it now had a human center. Those seeking favor began to calculate not only the sultan's will, but Hurrem's perception. Influence flowed less through ceremony and more through access, conversation, and private counsel. The empire's machinery remained intact, but its control room had moved. What unsettled the elite most was the realization that the change could not be reversed. There was no mechanism to restore the old order without challenging the sultan himself. Hurrem's marriage was not a policy that could be revised, it was a personal bond sanctified by law and faith. In that permanence lay its power. The system that had defined imperial intimacy for generations had ended not with resistance or rebellion, but with a wedding night that made the past impossible to reclaim. Sultan Suleiman's bond with Hurrem marked a profound departure from the way Ottoman power had traditionally been exercised, because it placed emotional intimacy at the center of imperial decision-making. Ottoman rulers were trained to govern through distance. Detachment was not cruelty, it was discipline. By maintaining emotional separation, a sultan preserved clarity, avoided favoritism, and ensured that personal affection never interfered with matters of state. Suleiman's relationship with Hurrem quietly dismantled this model, replacing restraint with connection in ways the court could neither predict nor control. What distinguished this bond was not mere desire, but Suleiman's willingness to share his inner world. He confided in Hurrem as he did in no advisor, revealing doubts, ambitions, and frustrations born from the immense burden of empire. Hurrem listened not as a subject awaiting command, but as a companion shaping understanding. Her responses were thoughtful, strategic, and often emotional, offering him something no council chamber could, a space free from ceremony and performance. Over time, Suleiman began to weigh her perspective alongside, and sometimes above, that of seasoned statesmen. This shift unsettled the political order because it altered the source of authority. Decisions were no longer forged solely through formal debate and institutional process. They were increasingly influenced by private dialogue, by shared nights and whispered conversations that left no record. Advisors sensed that access to the Sultan now passed through an emotional gateway, one that could not be navigated with rank or tradition alone. Power, once visible and procedural, was becoming personal. The implications of this change extended into Suleiman's style of rule. His governance grew more reflective, more responsive to human consequence rather than abstract principle. Hurrem's presence encouraged empathy, particularly in matters concerning mercy, charity, and domestic policy. While this humanization of power brought moments of compassion, it also sparked anxiety among officials who feared unpredictability. A ruler guided by feeling could be visionary, or dangerously partial. What made the bond revolutionary was Suleiman's refusal to hide it. Rather than masking his attachment, he elevated it through marriage, signaling that emotional loyalty was no longer a weakness to be concealed. This public acknowledgement shattered the illusion of the Sultan as an untouchable figure ruled solely by reason and law. He was now visibly human, bound by affection, and unashamed of it. In choosing intimacy over distance, Suleiman redefined authority itself. The empire was still ruled by conquest and law, but its pulse now beat within a shared emotional space. This transformation did not overthrow institutions overnight, yet it quietly reshaped how power moved, how decisions were formed, and how the Sultan understood his own role, not just as ruler of an empire, but as a man whose heart had become inseparable from the fate of his realm. For the women of the harem who had once believed influence lay within reach, Hurrem's marriage brought a devastating clarity. Their struggle was over before it could be won. The harem had always been a world of calculated hope, where patience, strategy, and timing could elevate a woman from obscurity to power. Favors shifted, alliances formed, and rivalries simmered beneath ritualized calm. With one marriage, that entire structure lost its meaning. The door to ascent closed, not gradually, but absolutely. These women understood the unspoken truth of the Ottoman court better than most, that survival depended on possibility. As long as the Sultan's attention could be redirected, ambition remained alive. Hurrem's permanence erased that possibility. No matter their beauty, intellect, or devotion, they could no longer imagine a future in which they stood at the center of power. Even motherhood, once the most reliable path to security, became uncertain, as legitimacy and influence now gathered around a single figure. The emotional impact within the harem was profound. Hope, once a quiet but sustaining force, dissolved into resignation. Some women withdrew into silence, others into bitterness. The rituals of preparation, the lessons in etiquette, music, and conversation, all designed to prepare them for a chance that would never come, now felt hollow. Their lives, meticulously shaped for a single purpose, had been rendered directionless by an event over which they had no control. Politically, this shift was just as significant. Rival factions that had once formed around potential mothers of princes collapsed. Without competition, there was no balance, no counterweight to Hurrem's influence. The internal checks that had stabilized the harem for generations disappeared. Officials who had relied on these rivalries to dilute power recognized the danger of a court without internal opposition. A single voice now echoed where many once competed. The realization also carried a deeper psychological blow. It exposed the fragility of the system that governed their lives. The harem had promised opportunity in exchange for obedience, ambition in exchange for sacrifice. Hurrem's rise revealed that the promise had always been conditional, subject to forces beyond merit or effort. The rules could change without warning, and when they did, those who believed in them were left unprotected. In the stillness that followed this realization, the harem ceased to be a place of anticipation and became a place of waiting. Waiting for reassignment, for obscurity, for an end that would never be explained. Hurrem had not merely won a contest, she had eliminated it entirely. In doing so, she transformed the emotional landscape of the palace, leaving behind a quiet certainty that the age of rivalry was over, and with it, the last illusion of shared possibility. The rise of Hurrem inevitably altered the position of the Valide Sultan, a role that had long stood as the most powerful female authority within the Ottoman court. Traditionally, the mother of the reigning sultan wielded immense influence, serving as advisor, gatekeeper, and stabilizing force within the palace. Her power rested on experience, lineage, and proximity to the throne, and her authority was rarely challenged. Yet Hurrem's new status introduced an unprecedented dynamic, one that slowly and quietly eroded this established dominance. As Suleiman's lawful wife, Hurrem gained direct and continuous access to the sultan that no other woman could rival, including his mother. While the Valide Sultan had shaped Suleiman's early worldview and political instincts, her influence was rooted in the past. Hurrem, by contrast, occupied his present. She shared his private hours, his vulnerabilities, and his reflections on rule. Over time, this proximity proved more potent than tradition. Counsel offered in moments of intimacy began to outweigh advice delivered through formal channels. This shift did not manifest as open conflict. Ottoman court culture favored subtlety over confrontation, and both women understood the dangers of visible rivalry. Instead, authority slipped gradually. Decisions that once passed through the Valide Sultan's approval now reached Suleiman without her mediation. Matters of patronage, charity, and internal appointments increasingly reflected Hurrem's preferences. The Valide Sultan remained respected, but respect was no longer synonymous with control. For the court elite, this transition was deeply unsettling. The Valide Sultan had functioned as a known quantity, a stabilizing presence whose influence followed predictable patterns. Hurrem, younger and unbound by precedent, represented uncertainty. Her rise signaled that power could be redefined not by maternal authority, but by emotional partnership. This inversion challenged the traditional hierarchy of the palace and introduced a new axis of influence centered on the sultan's personal life. The weakening of the Valide Sultan's role also carried symbolic weight. It marked the decline of generational authority in favor of conjugal influence. The mother who had guided the sultan to the throne now watched as another woman shaped the direction of his reign. This was not merely a personal loss, but a structural one. The mechanisms that had once balanced the inner court were shifting, leaving fewer barriers between Hurrem and the heart of power. As this transformation unfolded, it became clear that the Valide Sultan's authority was no longer absolute. It endured in ceremony and tradition, but its practical force diminished with each decision made beyond her reach. Hurrem had not seized power through confrontation, she had outgrown it through presence. In doing so, she reconfigured the hierarchy of the palace, proving that influence rooted in intimacy could quietly surpass authority built on legacy and role. That single wedding night came to symbolize the quiet birth of what later generations would recognize as the Sultanate of Women, a period when imperial power increasingly flowed through female influence within the palace rather than solely through military or bureaucratic channels. At the time, no proclamation announced this transformation, and no one named it as such. Yet those closest to the throne sensed that something irreversible had begun. Hurrem's elevation demonstrated that women of the inner court could now shape the empire's destiny not indirectly, but decisively. Hurrem's marriage legitimized female authority in a way the Ottoman system had previously resisted. Before her, women influenced politics through motherhood, maneuvering from the shadows once their sons ascended the throne. Hurrem altered this pattern by exercising power while her husband still ruled. Her influence did not wait for succession, it operated in real time. This redefinition expanded the political role available to women of the palace and quietly encouraged others to recognize their own potential reach. As Hurrem's voice gained weight, the internal balance of the empire shifted. Decisions concerning diplomacy, succession strategy, charitable foundations, and internal administration increasingly reflected priorities shaped within the private sphere. The palace, once divided between public governance and secluded domestic life, began to merge these realms. What was discussed behind veiled doors now influenced what unfolded across provinces and borders. The state's center of gravity moved inward, toward the personal relationships surrounding the sultan. This transformation unsettled the traditional elite. Viziers and military leaders were accustomed to negotiating power through rank, service, and conquest. The rise of palace women disrupted these pathways. Influence became less visible, less predictable, and harder to challenge. Authority no longer rested solely in councils or campaigns, but in trust, loyalty, and access to the ruler's inner world. The empire's political anatomy remained intact, but its circulation had changed. Hurrem's example set a precedent that could not be ignored. Future royal women observed and learned. They saw that intelligence, emotional insight, and strategic generosity could translate into real authority. Over time, mothers, wives, and daughters of sultans would exercise increasing control over succession, regency, and policy. What began as a singular marriage evolved into a broader pattern of female governance within the Ottoman system. The true power of that wedding night lay in its symbolism. It marked the moment when female presence ceased to be supplementary and became structural. The Ottoman Empire did not fall into the hands of women overnight, but its inner balance was permanently altered. From that night onward, the fate of the empire would be shaped not only on battlefields and council floors, but within the intimate spaces where influence whispered, endured, and quietly ruled. Hurrem's security as Suleiman's lawful wife transformed the political future of her children in ways that no concubine's offspring could ever fully claim. In the Ottoman system, every prince was a potential heir, yet not all claims carried equal weight. While sons of concubines were legally eligible to rule, their legitimacy depended heavily on shifting favor and circumstance. By becoming the sultan's wife, Hurrem elevated her children beyond uncertainty, anchoring their status in both law and perception at a time when perception often determined survival. This shift mattered profoundly in a dynasty governed by ruthless succession practices. Ottoman tradition did not guarantee peaceful inheritance, it rewarded strength, timing, and political support. Princes were sent to govern provinces, building alliances while quietly preparing for conflict. In this brutal environment, a mother's position could mean the difference between life and death. Hurrem's marriage ensured that her children were not merely contenders, but central figures in the dynastic narrative, protected by her unassailable presence at court. Her new status also strengthened her ability to advocate for her sons directly. As a concubine, her influence would have been informal and fragile. As a wife, her voice carried legitimacy. She could negotiate, persuade, and intervene without fear of dismissal. Officials understood that opposing her interests now meant opposing the sultan's household itself. This dynamic altered the calculations of those who sought favor, pushing alliances toward her children and away from rivals. The psychological impact of this security was just as significant. Hurrem's children grew within a framework of stability unknown to many princes before them. They were raised not as replaceable figures in a rotating system, but as heirs tied to a mother whose position could not be undone. This stability allowed for long-term planning, education, and strategic placement, advantages that translated directly into political strength. For rival princes and their supporters, this development was alarming. The balance that had once existed between different maternal lines began to tilt. Hurrem's children appeared increasingly inevitable, their future reinforced by both law and emotional loyalty. This perception alone shifted momentum. In Ottoman politics, inevitability often created reality, drawing support toward those seen as destined to prevail. Through her marriage, Hurrem did more than protect her sons, she restructured the logic of succession itself. Legitimacy, once dispersed among many potential heirs, now gathered around a single maternal figure. This concentration intensified competition and reshaped the empire's internal tensions. The fate of the next generation was no longer an open contest of equals, but a struggle defined by the quiet power of a mother whose marriage had rewritten the rules of survival. By the time dawn broke over Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire appeared unchanged to the outside world. The call to prayer rose as it always had, merchants opened their stalls, soldiers prepared for duty, and the machinery of empire moved forward with disciplined precision. No banners announced a revolution, no laws were rewritten overnight, and no borders shifted on a map. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, the empire's inner structure had been irrevocably altered. What had changed was not visible in stone or ceremony, but embedded in the relationships that governed power itself. That wedding night created a silent transformation at the core of authority. For the first time, the Sultan's private life and public rule were no longer carefully separated. Emotional loyalty had been formally bound to the throne, introducing a new force into governance, one that could not be measured, regulated, or removed. The empire still answered to Suleiman, but Suleiman now answered, in part, to a bond sanctified by faith and law. This subtle shift reoriented decision-making, reshaping how influence traveled through the palace. From that moment forward, access mattered more than position. The traditional hierarchy of advisors, councils, and institutions remained intact, but their monopoly on influence was broken. Power could now flow through private conversation, shared confidence, and trust built beyond protocol. Those closest to the throne recognized that the center of gravity had moved inward. The empire's future would be shaped not only in council chambers, but in spaces where politics and intimacy quietly intersected. The transformation was enduring because it was personal. Policies could be reversed, officials replaced, and customs adapted, but a lawful marriage could not be undone without destabilizing the throne itself. Hurrem's presence became a constant factor in imperial life, influencing succession, diplomacy, charity, and internal politics in ways that unfolded gradually over years. The change did not shock the empire into chaos, it guided it onto a new path without resistance precisely because it was so quietly embedded. What made this shift so powerful was its invisibility. The empire continued to project strength, order, and continuity, masking the fact that its internal logic had evolved. Tradition still framed authority, but intimacy now shaped it. The Ottoman state had not abandoned its past, yet it could never fully return to it. The old rules existed, but they no longer governed outcomes in the same way. By dawn, the world saw the same empire it had known the day before. But within the palace walls, a new reality had taken hold, one where power was no longer solely inherited, commanded, or enforced, but also shared. The transformation begun that night would echo through generations, altering the empire's course not through conquest or decree, but through a bond that quietly redefined what it meant to rule.